Okay, well, so I'm just going to start introducing myself and a little bit of the DDCR, and then Amadeus will continue. So we will give some time for people to join. So welcome everyone. My name is Maria. I'm one of the conservation officers here in the Dubai Desert Conservation Reserve. So most of you, I can recognize some names from the volunteer program. So most of you know us. But in case for the new joiners, the DDCR is the first national park that was established here in UAE. It was declared national park in 2003. So here, let's say that we have one of the last remnants of pure desert. So we have all the native plant species. We have a lot of species of animals. We have the Arabian oryx. It all started with maybe around 70 oryx that were brought from the US from a private collection, because as you may know, the Arabian oryx was extinct in the wild. And then with all the conservation efforts, we managed to bring it back to vulnerable. So that's only one of the achievements that we managed. So from those 70 individuals that we started with, now we have, for now at least, maybe 500, 600, but back in like a few years ago, we had like almost 800, 900. So with programs of relocation, we could take some oryx out of the reserve, because our current capacity it's 250, 300. So anyway, so apart from the Arabian oryx, we have gazelles, we have several species of reptiles, we have more than 150 species of birds, and so we have to do a lot of research. We have several surveys. Some of you came to help us to do the surveys. And one of the surveys that was carried out was about the Arabian red fox. So we have this fox here. And what we have to do is basically try to find the dens and then try to see if they are active or inactive. So today we have Amadeus DeKastle joining us. He has been working in Kyrgyzstan from 2009. He has done several projects, and he came the first time to the UAE, well, to DDCR in 2016, and then he came back in 2022 with some students from the American University of Central Asia, and they carried out the last survey of the Arabian red fox. So I'm going to give him the floor. He will share his presentation, and then in the end, we will have some time for questions and answers.
Great, thank you, Maria. While I'm setting up the sharing, I'll just kind of, add a little bit more. I've been to DDCR a few times, I think four now, 4 times altogether. And it's such a privilege to be able to be in, as Maria said, such a pristine kind of desert area. And the privilege gets extended to my students as well, which is great, because here in Kyrgyzstan, we don't have this kind of desert ecosystem. So really, really great opportunity. So yeah, foxes. Hopefully you guys are able to see my presentation, and I'm going to get started because I got a lot to say, and not a ton of time on, but we're going to try and push for this. Okay. So fox den surveys, because dens are a whole lot easier to find than the fox itself, because the dens don't move. And so we chose to do some work on fox dens and surveying those within the DDCR. And so I'm going to kind of share with you a little bit of the theory, the methodology, and then our outcomes from this research that we did in 2022 in February. I believe it was February. So yeah, like Maria and I've already mentioned, we have that cooperation between Dubai Desert Conservation Reserve, DDCR, and AUCA, the American University of Central Asia. This was the second time that I'd brought students. The first time was in 2021, and this time we came back kind of like a little bit more with a plan of action. The first time was kind of, to see like, is there some stuff we can do with students? And then the second one, we came with an actual proposed research project. And it was focused around the Arabian red fox and denning habits, right? Where do they like to build their dens? How many are there? And we can kind of, make some inferences based on that information. And it doesn't completely fit in with DDCR's management plan. Maybe some of you are familiar with that document. If you're not, it is available on DDCR's website. And Maria can probably send out a link for that as well anyways. But in my opinion, the fox, even though it's not one of the site-specific organisms that they're really, really interested in, it crosses over really well with Gordon's wildcat. Because they're both kind of eating the same foods, right? The cat is a little bit smaller than the red fox oftentimes, but they are kind of trying to get the same foods and probably also using the same habitats. And so although the wildcat is more important from a site management perspective, understanding the red fox's denning habits will help inform better what we can do with the wildcat. So that's where I see the red fox fitting in with DDCR's management plan there. Now, setting up the project, we had to make it pretty simple, right? Remember, I'm doing this with undergraduate students, and in Kyrgyzstan, undergraduate starts generally at the age of 17, 18, and so these are pretty young students. These aren't master's students, not PhD students. These are undergrads, and quite young at that. And so I'm trying to keep the steps simple, especially, just to make sure that that works. So we got project preparation, which I'm going to show you all of these steps in a minute, but project preparation, transect sampling, delineation of habitat types, and then our analysis, right? And here we got an image of a fox den as well. So those of you who have been to the DDCR know how big it is. And I had 6 students with me, as well as 2 DDCR staff were joining when they could, not every day, but when they could, because they're busy with things as well. And so we had a maximum of 9 people per day to go out and do this surveys. And so, and we had about 1 week. So if you know how big the DDCR is, you know that it's nearly impossible to survey the entire area on foot in that limited time frame. So we needed to kind of build some sort of a methodology that we could use to get enough data without walking every square centimeter of the reserve. Okay. So what we did was we built on a computer program called Quantum GIS, shortly QGIS. We took a map of DDCR, mapped out the boundary, and then we put in a system of grid survey points that were approximately 800 meters apart. And there were 313 of them throughout the reserve. And then what we did was we chose 15% at random, and we allowed the computer program to do that. And the reason why we needed it to be random was to keep us from being biased and choosing survey points where we were like, "Ooh, maybe that looks like a good spot for red foxes," right? If we bias our study, then our results are going to be biased and they're not worth anything scientifically. So doing this randomly was very, very important. So we ended up with 46 points throughout the reserve that we needed to go and survey through a transect. And transects, basically, it's just walking and looking for data as you're walking. And those, it depends on how your methodology is set up, what that transect might look like. But basically, we were going in an east-west fashion, 1 kilometer one direction, shift north or south by 100, 200 meters, and then walk back to our starting point. And so we were covering approximately 2 kilometers of distance each transect at each point. Okay. And this is kind of, what transect walk looks like in the DDCR. Lots of seemingly empty space, which upon closer inspection, obviously there are lots of things going on, including fox dens. So this is an example of a fox den I did find, and almost always, I think there was only 1 instance where we found a fox den that was not within vegetation somehow. This kind of makes a lot of sense because the roots of the vegetation help hold the soil together a lot better so that the den doesn't fall apart. And so a lot of time walking around vegetation, looking at all the different places where we could find these fox dens. And then when we did find them, We had a data sheet where we would write down all of the information that we determined was necessary for this survey. And here's our kind of raw data. We found a total of 44 dens. Not all of them were active. Only 12 of them were active. And what kind of constitutes an active den is, did we see footprints near them? Were they taken care of, right? If it's overgrown with vegetation or there's spider webs in there or something, that probably means the fox is not going in and out of that den on a regular basis, and so likely is not using it. And those would be called inactive dens. We also took data on the aspect, so which direction, based on a compass, was it pointing, and average height, average width, how many dens were found within Leptidemia, which is one of the plant species on the reserve, and then how many were found in Haloxylon, another plant species. So as you can see, 42 of the dens were found within only those two species of plant. There was one other den found in a different plant species, and then one just on its own in the sand. And so you can see statistically right there, it clearly shows the red fox has a preference on building its den within vegetation. Okay, so let's look at how these transects, because we took a GPS with us when we were doing these transects so that we would know exactly where we'd been, and we could build these transect buffers, basically. And so in this you can see all of those locations where that were randomly chosen for us to walk through, and you can see the paths that we took. Basically the way that this worked was, generally speaking, we had 4 people in a group, sometimes 3, sometimes 5, depending on how it got split up in the day. And we would kind of fan out and walk together forwards, and we would leave, I think, about 20 meters in between each person, because you can see about 20 meters fairly accurately whether or not there's a fox den. All right, so on our data sheet, we would also keep track of how many people were in the group, so that then we could keep track of approximate estimation of that 20-meter buffer per person, and then we can add that buffer in, and we get this kind of wider track. So you can see some of these are a little bit wider, some of them are a little bit skinnier, and that's based on the number of people that were in the group during that survey. And these tracks are really important because it can help us understand which type of habitat we're walking around it. Okay, so I also want to point out we did not end up getting all of those points. The 15% wasn't quite reached. These two, we chose not to do these because they would be right along the fence line, which would be walking along a dirt road. There's the road that goes all the way around the DDCR. If you've been there, you know that. And it wouldn't have made a lot of sense to be looking for fox dens along a road like that. But these 3, we frankly just did not end up with enough time. But you'll see later, based on the statistics of how much space we did cover, we do believe that it was enough to have a statistical importance. So yeah. Using satellite imagery, we put together a classification map, right? So there's kind of 4 main habitat types within the reserve. There's gravel plains, that's where you have the spiny-tailed lizard, and other things as well living there, but it's this darker colored splotches here. And you can see there's not a lot of it, but that's definitely one of the main habitat types within the reserve. There's a lot of shifting dunes, right? These are dunes that still move. And then we have stationary dunes. These are ones that don't really have a lot of movement and have perhaps a little bit more vegetation on them, holding them together. And then we also have vegetated areas, and you can kind of see some clusters of vegetation throughout the reserve. Also on this map, you can see the locations where we did find fox dens. You can notice right away that for the most part, they're kind of clustered in the northern part and the southern part of the reserve. There are a few other ones spread throughout sporadically, but there were kind of two clusters, and which was kind of interesting. So, but this is the habitat map. Basically, the way that this should work is you should be able to choose a location on this map and go to it and say, is this shifting dunes? Oh, yeah, it is shifting dunes. Or am I in a vegetated area like the map says I am? Yes, I am in a vegetated area like the map says I am. Right, so this map then allows us to kind of overlay our transects, which is why it was important to build these transects. So we can overlay those, right? And then we can kind of dissect them and see how much of our transects was over top of gravel plains, for example. Not a lot. Okay, but there's also not a lot of gravel plains within the reserve. So that's how much was over top of gravel plains. This is how much was over top of shifting dunes. This is the stationary dune overlap. All right, and then I'm gonna kind of combine gravel plains vegetation and one more not really significant ecosystem type or habitat type, but there is a little bit of water within the reserve as well. There's two small ponds and then a few oases as well. And so anyways, what I've done is I've kind of grouped those together, and then excuse me. And then we add in shifting dunes, gravel plains, vegetation, and water. So all of those together. So you can see how this is all kind of adding up. Here we've added our stationary dunes as well. And you can see from this that it is the same as the original, right? But what we've done is we've now kind of broken it into the different pieces, the different habitat types that we walked across. So now we can use that same computer program, QGIS, and we can determine our area of each of those habitat types that we walked across, right? And so that's what we've done here. Now, these first two columns, these are the total percents within the DDCR. This is not what we were walking. This is the total amount that's within the DDCR, okay? So there's a little bit more than 4 square kilometers of gravel plains, a little bit more than 102 square kilometers of shifting dunes. And so you can see the numbers there. And the total percent of the DDCR of that habitat type is shown in this column here, right? So you can see shifting dunes and stationary dunes make up the majority of the DDCR, right? Now, these next two are specifically about what we walked in our transects. So the total area covered in transects of gravel plains was about 0.36 square kilometers. Not a lot, but there's not a lot of gravel plains in the DDCR. 0.5 square kilometers of shifting dunes, 9.8 of stationary dunes, very small amount of vegetated area, and a small. And so we look at the percentage of the percentage surveyed of the habitat type, right? So how much of this 4.5 is 0.36, and it's 8.82%. And so you can see those numbers there. So we got almost 10%, almost 10%, almost 10% of the three of the main habitat types. I'll talk about vegetated areas in a second, why it's so low. But then also the percentage of total survey, right? How much of the survey did we do was gravel plains? And it was 1.84%, which when we look at how much of the total percent of DDCR is gravel plains, those are almost exactly the same. So we covered an approximate equal amount of percentage in our survey as the DDCR offers of gravel plains, also shifting dunes, and stationary dunes. Not so much in terms of vegetated area, but again, I'll explain that right now. Much of the vegetated area is either right around the hotel area, and then also there are some vegetative patches of basically small farming areas to grow the feed for the oryx, as Maria was talking about. There's some supplementary food that they those farms are fenced off, so even if we wanted to, we probably wouldn't have been able to go through. But then, yeah, I mean, also random survey with those points just did not end up putting us into these locations either. But based on the three main categories, gravel plains, shifting dunes, and stationary dunes, our percentage of the total survey was actually really, really close to the actual percent of DDCR, which is really cool to see based on a randomized survey. So looking at our results, continuing on with that a little bit, in shifting dunes, we found 4 active dens. I'm not going to count in the inactive dens because if they're not being used, they still matter, but they don't matter to the same degree as active dens because we know that the foxes are using these, and so there's more importance to those, right? So we found 4 within shifting dunes. We found 8 within stationary dunes. We did not find any in the gravel plains or in the vegetated areas. Now, I think a good point to mention is that when I say vegetated areas, this is based on satellite imagery using what's called an NDVI. So basically looking at how much reflectance from vegetation is being given off to a satellite, which sounds really complicated, but it's basically the satellite is kind of calculating how much light is being reflected from plants. All right. That's not to say that there are not plants in shifting dune areas, stationary dune areas, gravel plain areas. It's just that vegetated areas kind of have a higher amount of plants than these other locations. Okay. And so they're called vegetated, likely because a lot of it is also more taken care of. Like I said, they've got some of those farms. Those are irrigated. And so there's a lot more vegetation that's reflecting sunlight back in a certain way to the satellite. So just to make that clear, there are obviously plants in these other areas, okay, but they don't come out categorized as vegetated areas. But yeah, here's our total of 12, 4 in shifting, 8 in stationary. Per square kilometer, it's 0.42 dens per square kilometer, 0.81 in stationary dunes. And so we can use that and we can extrapolate that based on the total amount of the total square area of shifting dunes and stationary dunes within the reserve at 43 active dens within the shifting dunes, 95 within stationary dunes. Okay, so we can get those totals there. Now, this is obviously looking at presence absence, and that's not to say that there were not false absences, right? Where we may have walked past one without noticing, or we may have, there's false negatives, there's false positives, and it would be really interesting to in the future, if we do another survey like this, to have more than one group go through the same area to see if the numbers match up. Because there are other ways, there's other statistical ways to check this, because I know from personal experience in the past, in previous years that I've been at the DDCR, foxes do make dens in gravel plain areas. I've seen it. But we just didn't come across any this time. And so although our estimate number is 0 within gravel plains, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is absolutely true, that there are no red fox dens within the gravel plains. But based on our data, based on our surveys, this is the numbers that we're getting. Okay, so yeah. When you do the whole average, we've got 0.42, 0.81. When you do the whole average to figure out the entire reserve, what things look like, we find that there's an estimated density per square kilometer of 0.61. Now, when you look in the literature, there's stuff that looks at alpine areas in Northern Africa, Northern Europe. I will say the red fox is on all of the continents except for Antarctica. It's not necessarily native to each of those locations. It's been introduced into Australia, introduced into South America, but it is in those locations. And so there's a lot of studies around the world that look at the red fox from different perspectives. And the data that I was able to find on den density shows that the DDCR has actually a fairly decent den density for the type of habitat that it is. Right, we have a variable semi-arid desert. Right, there's a few different types of microhabitats within there, but generally it's a semi-arid desert, fairly similar to what would be found in the study for Northern Africa was in Tunisia. And when you look at that closest analog, Tunisia, the DDCR actually seems to have a fairly decent number of dens within the reserve compared to a similar climate, similar habitat type. Um, Obviously, you look at a place like Northern Europe where there's a lot more forest. There's certainly more precipitation, and as a result of all of those things, the type of habitat that they live in, there's more prey for them to access, and so they have a higher fecundity rate, etc., which means that the population is higher, such as the den density is then higher as well. But we're seeing pretty great numbers, actually, in my opinion, at the DDCR. Some more results. One thing that I found really interesting as I was going through this data was the proximity to other habitat types. Whenever we found a den, for example, dens that were found in shifting dunes, how close were they to the other habitat types? Right? When we found something within the stationary dunes, how close were they to the other habitat types? And it's really interesting to notice that those dens that were in shifting dunes were really quite close to stationary dunes, only 14 meters on average away from that other habitat type. And the same basically 229 meters away from shifting dunes for dens that were found within stationary dunes. So basically what this is telling me is that although it seems that foxes have a slight preference, right, for stationary dunes, right, we have more that we found in stationary dunes, and the den density is a little bit higher. Even though there seems to be a little bit more of a preference, really, the dens were kind of built right in the middle, right there next to both types of habitat types. This may be a result of the way that the map was produced, or this might just be that they really like being kind of on that edge of habitat type. But what really stands out to me here is that by and large, foxes did not build their dens very close to gravel plains or to vegetated areas, right? Almost 3 kilometers on average was the closest that they would build to a gravel plain. 2.5 kilometers on average was how close they would build their dens to a vegetated area. And again, I say this completely knowing that the vegetated areas, for the most part, within the reserve are around the resort area, right? So there's a lot of human activity going on there. There's lots of cars, there's lots of people. They're probably going to try and stay away from those types of areas. And also the farms, which are fenced off, and they'd probably, be harassed if they tried to get in by people that are working there. And so it makes sense that they probably wouldn't want to be next to the vegetated areas. The gravel plains, there's probably competition for space because, as I mentioned earlier, the spiny-tailed lizard is living in these gravel plain areas. That is its habitat of choice. And so if there's a lot of lizards, because they are quite large lizards, I think they're at least like half a meter. Maria, you can correct me if I'm wrong later. But they're quite large lizards, and they are building their own burrows, their own dens within the gravel plains. And so if there's competition for habitat space, perhaps the red fox just goes, hey, I'll just build over there because no one's bothering me. I don't have to fight anybody for space. I don't need to be next to the gravel plains. Perhaps that's one explanation. There's likely other explanations as well, but I found that really interesting that by and large, all of the dens that we found were quite far away from both gravel plains and vegetation. really interesting data that came out of that. So what does this data kind of like in the end tell us? The number of dens per square kilometer, definitely higher than the closest analog in, as I mentioned, in Tunisia, which is really great to see. Red foxes seem to prefer stationary dune habitat, but as I mentioned, the ones that were not in stationary dunes were close to stationary dunes, and the ones that were in stationary dunes were also similarly close to shifting dunes. So it looks like there might be a preference, but that may just be based on the way that the map was produced. And then also denning is usually within 2 species of desert bush, which is also interesting. But what else can we do in the future? Maria and I were talking a little bit before this, and she mentioned that DDCR was already looking forward for next year to do another fox den survey. They should be done regularly, right? I mean, it's an important species within the reserve. It's the largest predator within the reserve that's left. Within the Emirates, I'm not sure if there's any wolf population or cheetah population left anywhere within the Emirates, but I know that at one point those 2 species did exist. But within the DDCR, the red fox is the largest predator left. Mammal predator. I'm sure that there are some predatory birds that are larger, but so it's an important study to be doing. But perhaps further studies can incorporate these other aspects as well. It'd be really interesting to find out what is the average number of dens used per family unit, because foxes, they live in family units. Okay, so at any given time of the year, that number may be different, right? Right when the baby foxes are born, that family unit number is going to be kind of large. But then later on in the year, as some of the family members age out of the family and go and produce their own families, or sadly sometimes baby foxes die, but these numbers change over time. But we need to figure out what is an average number of dens that's used per family unit and what is the size of that family unit. That will help us kind of gauge what's the total population within the DDCR, because we know an estimate of how many dens are within the DDCR, and if we can figure out how many dens does an actual family unit use, right? They've got like their winter home, their summer home, their spring home, kind of like that, right? They move around a little bit, but they don't necessarily quit using the den that they just moved out of. They may go back to it. So how many dens per family unit, and then how many foxes per family unit, and that would give us an approximate, a nice estimation of how many red foxes are actually within the DDCR. It would be interesting to find out more on site selection, right? Plant species, we already saw, it looks very obvious at first glance that the red fox is using 2 specific plant species. Is that because they're choosing those plant species, or are they just opportunistic and that's the main plant species that's in the area where they're choosing to live, right? Proximity to, I mentioned earlier, proximity to the oasis. There are multiple small little oases throughout the reserve to provide water for the animals. So there are the 2 ponds, but there's also these small oases as well. Does the red fox build their dens close to those locations or not? Would be an interesting aspect to look at. And then also aspect specifically, it looks like, generally speaking, foxes are building their dens with the opening facing either northwest or northeast, somewhere within that range. So there's, generally speaking, they're pointing at least north-ish. And is there a reason for that? I mean, it seems pretty obvious that they're building it so that the sun isn't going directly into their doorway, because the sun is coming from the south. And so they're on average pointing it away from the sun. And then another good thing, and this kind of brings back to DDCR's management plan, is when we look at where we find fox dens, to what point does this overlap with where we would expect to find Gordon's wildcat? How much overlap is there? So then how much competition might there be between the wildcat and the fox? And since the wildcat is a priority species within the DDCR, this would be an important aspect of a study to check, because the more competition we have with the red fox means the more work we have to do with the wildcat in order to bring those numbers up. Yeah, so these are some things that I would love to see happen in the future based on the data that we've collected. I should also mention, I think Basil Roy is in the group as well, so maybe he might have something to say on this as well. He was involved in the data collection, and he's also working with me on, we are writing up our data into a publication format, and hopefully soon we will be able to send it in for publication, and you guys can look at the more official version of what this data means. But yeah, so I suppose at this point, Maria, I think we open it up for some questions. Yeah. And I've
Hi,
tried really
yes.
hard to kind of keep myself within those 30 minutes, but I think I went over a little. So I
That's
apologize if I
fine.
rushed through anything. Yeah.
No, it's fine. Thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions, you have the part of Q&A. So you are more than welcome. And also, if something pops up later, you can always send me an email and then I can contact Amadeus. So just a couple of comments. Well, first of all, thank you so much for all the results. It is very interesting. It is quite a big survey, like, like it's we do have a lot of surveys, and it's true that we should do more of the Arabian red fox, but it is like quite an extensive survey. But I do have to say that we are, well, Basil, he was in contact with a company from the US, and they sent us two collars, two trackers for foxes. So we are
Wow.
going to, yes, very soon. We are just working in the last details regarding the software, because they are going to release by themselves, like they are the ones that they open automatically. So actually today they have the meeting for those last details. So yeah, so we are hoping to catch two foxes to put the colors, and then I think it's for about 3 months or 4 months, we will just track their location. So at least it would give us, like, it will give us more details, because normally when we see them, it's at night, obviously. And also in the camera traps next to the water holes. So yeah, this would
Yeah.
be, this will bring more light into the
Well, I think that just
information.
having those two collars would help answer how many dens does a fox use? Because you'll see that they're going to the same locations on a regular basis, and those would likely be denning areas. And so you could see, like, how many dens is this individual using? That could help answer one of those questions. Cool.
Yeah, actually, Hassan here, he asked something related to that. He asked, does the den density of the DDCR translates to a similar den density outside of the DDCR within wider UAE? I'm not sure you have done any studies out of the territory.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the reasons why I was asked to do this survey is because, from what I understood, well, the director that you have now is different than the director that was there when I was doing the study. But his understanding was that there was not a lot of data available on red fox within the UAE, which is why we wanted to do a study like this. Um, Tunisia, the study that I found in Tunisia was the only one that I found that had information on den density. There were other studies where they looked at like number of foxes within a family unit in somewhere in Saudi. There was something else. Anyways, there were other studies that were being done, but not all of these studies were looking specifically at den density. And so, Hassan, I can't give you an answer on that because they're just, like, none of the sources that I found had information on den density. Other than the closest analog I could find was Tunisia.
Mm. We do have some relocations. So Dubai municipality last year they brought, I'm not sure, maybe someone from my team can correct me. I think it was like 4 or 5 foxes from outside of the reserve, like in places where they are doing some like building or whatever.
Yeah.
3. Okay, thank you, Hera. So yeah, so they obviously the Dubai municipality team, they checked the foxes and did all the, like, I mean, that they were healthy, and then we translocate them here. So we did the release in the south of the reserve where it's like the least contact with humans, and we believe that they are okay. So yeah, so there are foxes outside of the reserve, and we have a lot of people kind of like contacting us because they see them around the neighborhoods or closely to the desert. So but yeah, it would be interesting to see where do they live,
Yeah.
like in these areas. And so yeah.
Yeah, I wonder
Okay.
what a study like that would look like outside of the DDCR. Could be
Yeah,
very interesting.
definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure because obviously, like around us, we do still like have some deserts. So on one of the sides, we kind of like get close to the higher mountains, to the highway, but maybe in that stretch, and then also on the other side, we have all the Sharia part of the country. So, yeah. So anyway, well, I don't think we have any more questions. So again, if someone wants to know anything else in detail, you can always contact me. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I just wanted to say that we also have an event in the coming 7th of September. So we have our visitor center where I am today, and because it's the International Vulture Awareness Day, so we will open our visitor center from 10 to 6. It's going to be for free, so you can always bring your family. And then we have 2 speakers that will talk about the vultures. It's going to be at 11 and at 4 p.m. for 1 hour. So they will talk about the vultures here in the DDCR and also outside of the reserve and also in other countries. So thank you so much, everyone. I will publish soon the next webinar. I think it's going to be in October. It's with Theo. He's actually today joining in the. I can see him. So yeah. So hopefully I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Amadeus, as well.
Of course. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.